unseen forces and invisible threats. Welcome to Wait, What Do You Do Again? I'm your host, Megan Ford. We are wrapping up our October spooky season series with our guest, Dr. Mikki Brock. Dr. Brock teaches British and Atlantic history, the Reformation, witchcraft and the devil, and the history of poverty. Her research focuses on the supernatural, religious beliefs, and identities in early modern Scotland. How cool is Dr. Brock? In this conversation, we talk about fear, faith, and control from the witch trials of Calvinist Scotland and how those inform the Salem witch trials here in the United States, to a devil on TikTok who just wants to do jello shots with you in the woods. It was a really fun conversation. It's smart and spooky, and I think the most interesting part is it shows how history isn't so removed from our current daily lives. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, leave a review, send it to a friend. It really helps, and I appreciate it. Okay, let's go. Dr. Brock, thank you for being here today. I'm really excited for our conversation. You describe your work as studying witches, demons, and things that go bump in the night, which is very fun. How did you first get drawn into this world of the supernatural, if that's the right way to describe it?
Yeah. So, I think as a child, I always had questions about the nature of the universe, the nature of the human experience, the nature of God, afterlife, all of those things. So, for me, my journey into the supernatural was kind of satisfying some of these personal curiosities I had as I tried to figure out what I believed and
Mhm.
how I sort of understood the world. Um, I was always that kid who, in any sort of lessons or things like that was asking why? And that, I grew up in Dallas, and most people around me had a very specific belief system. And certainly that was sort of what I was brought up in. So I always had questions, right?
Mhm.
So I, as a kid, would go to the library in our school and check out like every book on like werewolves and witches and ghosts and things like that. Partially because I wanted to understand why people believed in these things, like what it sort of meant to live in a world where you felt there were lots of invisible forces. And I had heard a lot about God and some about the devil, but I also really wanted to know how people believed across time and space. So for me, it was an interest in belief. So like, kind of, I'm sure it was some degree of pop culture,
Sure.
right? Watching Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the original
So
version, or
good.
yeah, exactly. So I'm sure those were elements to it as well. And then when I um, went to undergrad, I started learning about the history of the witch trials. I went to the University of Kansas. I had a wonderful class with a professor called Eve Levin about medieval Russia, and she was really interested in ideas about folk magic and eventually the witch trials, and which were interesting in Russia because the vast majority of those accused of witchcraft were men, which deviates from the
Mm.
sort of norm in Europe as a whole. Anyhow, I got fascinated in some of this stuff, and I had always been interested in Salem, so I started sort of thinking about witchcraft and witch trials, and that led me down this sort of path of asking deeper questions about the belief systems and the structures that allowed something like the witch hunts to take place. And that kind of took me into my graduate studies, and yeah, everything from there.
Yeah. What did your parents think when you were little and asking these questions and were kind of into it?
Yeah, I have to say my parents were less, it's not that they were sort of strict and religious, it was more that that's what my high school was like. I mean, this was the heyday of like the Left Behind series, right?
Mhm.
I don't know if you followed everything on like Rapture Talk the last
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
week, which was fascinating.
We're
To
still
really like,
here. Yeah.
right? Yeah, no, I mean, well, clearly you and I didn't make the cut.
No.
I'm sure it happened. But it was the heyday of that. It was the heyday of the WWJD bracelets. So it was less actually about, like, what my parents thought. I think actually they weren't, I'm not sure how close attention they were paying to sort of what I was reading and doing. But it was more, I remember having a conversation with a girl that I went to middle school with, and I had a friend who was Jewish, and I remember telling her about this friend, and she was like, "Well, that friend is not gonna go to heaven." And I sort of was like, "Well, that doesn't make sense. She's great." I
Right.
had questions about that sort of dominant belief system. And I remember one day she actually brought the Bible to school to show me why she didn't think my Jewish friend would go. I mean, this is suburban
Yeah,
Dallas.
yeah.
And so I think actually the curiosity about the questions I was asking came less from my parents per se.
Mhm.
Although certainly I think some extended family eyebrows were raised, and more, you know, being the sort of kid who went to a Christian camp in middle school, but also had questions.
Mhm.
That it was more of a sort of social dynamic there that raised eyebrows. I will say, when I went to college and did my PhD, my doctoral dissertation was on belief in the devil in
Mhm.
early modern Scotland, and there I legit had some relatives though who were like thought I was studying like Satanism or becoming a Wiccan, which I wasn't. But
Yeah.
I think sometimes it can be hard for people to understand that you're studying something from a secular perspective
Mhm.
and you're trying to ask questions that satisfy that and a scholarly interest rather than, becoming a practitioner in some sense. So that's a
Yeah.
long-winded answer to your question, but
Yeah.
yeah,
That's really interesting, and I think many of us go through that at some point, right? And those
for sure.
questions of why, and I'm probably a little bit older than you, but I also think it's interesting. There's the pop culture aspect, and then the rise of
Yeah,
cults in the United States,
sure.
and I don't know that it's a rise of cults, but at least cults in the national narrative, and like
Yeah,
Waco and
yeah,
all of that, and like what people's
sure.
belief systems
Yeah,
were. And I mentioned this on the podcast before. I was raised Catholic
yeah,
and very much was like, stay away from demonology, stay away
yeah,
from
yeah,
witchcraft,
yeah,
stay away from all
yeah.
that stuff, and was really scared as a little kid of it. And then as I got older, and I was like, wait a minute. So we're lighting candles, we're chanting in unison, we're
No.
ringing bells. And not to discredit that faith or any faith, but I was like, there is something that connects all of us across faith and belief
Mm-mm.
systems. And I love that invisible forces, right? Like there's
Yeah.
something in human nature about that.
There is, and I think part of it is from my vantage point, we're all asking the same questions, right? I'm teaching a class right now on the history of the devil, which is a sort of senior seminar, and it's a really great group of students. But what we're talking about in there are these perennial questions that lots of faith traditions have tried to answer, which is, why is there evil in the world? Right? Why do bad things happen to otherwise good people?
Mhm.
What happens after you die? What is death like? I mean, people are searching for meaning, and every faith tradition has these conversations about what's true, what's false, what's heterodox, what is true doctrine. So for me, my interest, I think, in all of this, and my interest as a kid, sort of growing up in a particular Protestant culture, is, why do people believe the way that they do, and how is the perception of, as you say, living in this world of invisible forces really powerful in ways we don't always understand? I mean, Kierkegaard said that sometimes an unconscious relationship is more powerful than a conscious one, and I think so much of our world in popular culture and in everything else is governed by binary thinking, right? Sort of black and white, good, evil, punishment, absolution, all of these things. We still use the language of like martyrs and hagiography, even if we're not consciously doing so, right? That's
Mhm.
something I've been thinking a lot about recently. That are, particularly American culture, so suffused with this stuff. So
Mhm.
even if we're not actively sort of thinking, well, I'm asking a religious question, or this person is sort of thinking in a religious way, it informs so much. And
Right.
I think that's actually something that people miss when they try to analyze the state of American politics or the sort of state of the world or whatever from a purely secular perspective. So,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And your work focuses on, and make sure I'm getting this correct, early modern England and the role of witchcraft and demonology in that society.
the primary focus of my work is religion and the supernatural in early
Mhm.
modern Scotland.
Got
So
it. Okay.
Scotland is my focus. Yeah.
And what drew you to Scotland?
So I mean, who doesn't love Scotland,
Well, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But but I have to say, it wasn't Braveheart, which
Yeah.
is historically a lot of people's interest. Although, funnily enough, whenever I bring up Braveheart, none of my students have seen it because, right, it came out in the 90s. Like, I think it's like 96. So it's like, okay. Now it's Outlander and the Outlander effect. But
Yes.
no, actually, for me, it wasn't any sort of pop culture thing about Scotland. It's just that when I was an undergraduate, I started reading about the witch hunts, and Scotland had actually really intense witchcraft trials. If you were a woman who lived in early modern Scotland, you were 12 times more likely to be accused of witchcraft than your English counterpart. And so I was wanting to know, A, why is that? And that led me to being interested in what people believed about the devil in that period. So for me, my interest in Scotland came less from like castles than
Hmm.
men in kilts or whatever, and more the sort of it was a perfect laboratory to answer the questions that I wanted to explore. Now, of course, I've spent a lot of time in Scotland and a lot of time in Edinburgh, and I think it's the greatest place in the world. But
Yeah.
my entree into it was based on these sort of intellectual questions.
And when did that change happen in Scotland? Did it have to do with like England sort of and the United Kingdom and the Church of England, or was it even before that that there started to be this resistance to witches or the devil or
Yeah,
things of that nature?
yeah, that's a great question. So Scotland and England, they didn't share a government until, well, they didn't share parliaments until 1707. They had the same monarch from 1603 on. But the witch hunts in Scotland started in the 16th century after the Scottish Reformation, which was in 1560. Scotland became Protestant, and particularly a sort of Calvinist version of Protestantism that develops into this Presbyterian church structure. That happens later than England. England's Reformation is earlier. And actually, I think that's interesting. I think the fact that Scotland's Reformation is later means that there's this whole generation of clerics, of folks who are thinking about these big ideas as the Reformation is swirling in Europe. And what that means is that there's really this programmatic structure of reform that they try to implement. There's been enough time to really think about how they want to do the Reformation right in Scotland. So the Reformation happens in 1560, and you have some of the first major witch hunts in the decades after that. And the reason it is so intense, to answer that question of like, why does this start happening there as opposed to England? It's really sort of threefold. The sort of, you have a Scottish king, King James VI, who becomes James I of England. He was the king when Shakespeare wrote a lot of his major works like Macbeth. So this is how people sometimes know about him. But he was really interested while he was King of Scotland before he assumed the English throne in witchcraft. He actually thought he himself had been the victim of witches sort of plotting his downfall. He was coming back with his bride Anne of Denmark from Denmark, and he bringing her back, and there were storms that waylaid things, and so he thought witches were sort of involved in doing this, and this leads to some famous witch hunts in the early 1590s. But that was one of the reasons. The other reason I think is this really emphatic sort of Calvinist totalizing approach to faith that they have in Scotland, which lent itself to a real insistence on having religious purity, right? If you're going to be
Hmm.
this sort of city upon a hill, and they have a very sort of Puritan understanding in that way, you can't have witches running amok and doing lots of things. So there's a desire really to sort of purify the church, and they develop I could get very boring in this, but I'll
No,
just say
I
they
love it.
develop a
Yeah.
system of like some level of social surveillance through these ecclesiastical courts called kirk sessions. So every parish in all of Scotland has a group of people who work with the minister who's tasked with sort of enforcing moral discipline among individuals.
Hmm.
And that means you have this sort of system where people are really paying attention to behavior. And if there are people running afoul of the sort of dictates of good and godly behavior, they can report it to your local church council, right? Your Kirk session is what they call them. And then they can investigate it. Well, what this means is there are very clear pathways of reporting deviant behavior, like maybe doing a little bit of magic, maybe being reported to have muttered a curse, that they know who to go to. So these things get reported at the local level. And then they get picked up by sort of courts that bring criminal charges against witches. So part of it's this sort of political, religious, and legal system that facilitates the project of witch hunting. You have the church and the state working together, really trying to go after witches. And sort of you don't have the same sort of religious fervor for it in England, but you also don't have the legal and political structures that really encourage witch hunting. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's really interesting. And
it
so
is.
if like you reported me to the council, what was the report like what was the
Yeah.
reward or benefit to the person?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So let's say my neighbor, I have a farm, and my neighbor next to me, we've always had bad blood. And then one day she and I get into a row, and she kind of mutters some things under her breath as she walks away. And she's known to be a woman who like doesn't go to church as much as she should, or she has kind of a scandalous reputation. And the next day, my cow dies,
Hmm.
right? People's way of understanding misfortune often did revolve around this idea that words were really powerful and harmful magic is something that people could make happen. The term is maleficium for it. So it's often these neighborly disputes that bring an initial allegation. But if that happens to you, if you think this woman killed your cow, you can tell your local minister or your local elder, and they'll start kind of an initial investigation. And if it seemed that there was enough sort of juice there, if it seemed like, yeah, this woman might be a witch, then they would refer that crime to the court of justiciary, which was the higher criminal court, which is the one that could actually execute witches. So often these witchcraft allegations, they start at the very local level. They're kind of quotidian, right? Like, again, she killed my cow, she made my husband impotent, whatever. Um, but then if they're taken seriously, that's when they go to the higher courts. And that's when a lot of the folks involved start asking questions about, did you meet the devil? Did you sign a pact? Is that how you got the power to do what you did to the cow?
Hmm.
So there's a real infrastructure for this. People, I think, sometimes imagine that the early modern witch trials are these extrajudicial things, right? That they are just people basically attacking others and attacking their neighbors. But there's a really organized system. There are laws on the books for pursuing the crime. Scotland has a law in 1563 that really makes it clear that witchcraft is both a heresy and a sort of capital secular crime that needs to be punished. Lots of other places have laws like that on the books. So yeah, it's there's a
Fascinating.
definite yeah, it is really interesting. To be clear, like this is not because, and I think this is important. This is not because like the farmer is pissed off at this old lady and wants to get her, so he makes up a witchcraft charge.
Hmm.
This really was people's explanatory framework, right? It's
Yeah.
easy to kind of functionalize things and think that witchcraft accusations are really about something else, but people really believed in these things. They
Yeah.
feared witches, they feared the actions of the devil in the world, and they
Yeah.
wanted to find a way to keep themselves safe from harmful magic. And from the perspective of the church, they really want to make sure the devil doesn't have a bunch of servants running around, like
Yeah.
overturning their project of building Christendom.
Yeah. And so, two questions from that. The first is, how did they prove it? Was it essentially individuals
Mm,
saying, like, yes, I did magic or I did sign a pact with the devil? But what if someone was like, no, their cow just
yeah.
died? Like, how did they prove the
Yeah, no,
charges?
no. I mean, no, for sure. I mean, this is a really, really important question because one of the reasons why the witch trials in Scotland get more intense than in England, for example, is that um, even though you're technically supposed to get permission to use torture to elicit a confession from, you're not supposed to just use torture willy nilly. You have to make
Mhm.
a case according to the laws about why you're using it. But sometimes less less sort of judicious jurists would use it anyway. So sleep deprivation or thumb screws or whatever. So eliciting a confession, right, was the best sort of proof, right? That's the
Mhm.
gold standard of proof in a witch trial. And these are fantastical allegations, right? Like
Right.
we know
Yeah.
that people are not making pacts with the devil, and or it seems people may have been practicing magic, but the demonic magic
Yeah.
piece is
Yeah.
very
Yeah. Yeah.
unlikely. Um, so getting that, if you have the capacity to use torture, if you can kind of get away with it, and Scotland's system is decentralized, like there are these local meetings, there's just the justiciary court that's sitting on circuit, and they're trying a lot of the witches. Because it's decentralized, there's not a lot of oversight in some cases, so they can use torture, they can get people to confess. So confessions are the main sort of thing that people want. But the other thing is witness testimony.
Mhm.
So if you read these cases, right? If you go to Edinburgh and you look at the justiciary court records, the witchcraft trials, they often have really long lists of witness testimonies being like, yes, 7 years ago, uh, this woman, Janet, whomever, did this to me, sort of racking their brain, trying to put two and two together. So a
Mhm.
lot of these are very old neighborly grievances that get
Interesting. Yeah.
expressed in these
Yeah.
witness testimonies. So you have to have enough witness testimonies to then begin the process of really intense questioning to seek a confession. So
Gotcha.
those are the ingredients. Sometimes people don't confess though. To be clear, a lot of people are like, yeah, absolutely not. I didn't do this. But if the weight of the evidence that's suggested by the witnesses is strong enough, and if Scotland is in the midst of a sort of witch panic,
Yeah.
then they could be convicted. Because sometimes you just have like the isolated incident of a witchcraft allegation, and then maybe that person gets acquitted. But if you're in this moment, like just to give you an example, there's Scotland's biggest witch hunt is 1661, 62, and lots of people are getting accused, and some people are confessing. That adds to the fervor, and then someone is more likely to be convicted even without that confession, if
Hmm.
that makes sense. Because there's this real confidence that like witchcraft, this is the language they sometimes use, it's abounding in the land and we have to go
Mm.
after it.
Yeah. Ooh, I
So
love
yeah,
that, bounding in the land. Did
abounding in the land, yes.
did they believe at this time in like the devil or demons possessing people, or was it really something that people chose to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's another really good question. So Scotland had fewer cases. I'll answer that for Scotland, and I'll answer it more broadly. So
Okay.
Scotland has fewer cases of demonic possession than, say, England, and certainly fewer than like in France or wherever. And that is partially because there was, I think, a little bit of nervousness within kind of Calvinist theology, which has a lot of insistence on the sovereignty of God,
Mhm.
that if you believed in possession or you gave the devil too much power in that way, it might chip away at sort of God being this all-powerful figure. There was also the sense that a lot of humans were kind of fallen. Most of humanity is reprobate according to the church, meaning only a few who are elect get to go to heaven, and that's only
Mhm.
by God's grace. It's not by works. It's very different than the Catholic system.
Yeah.
If you think most of the world is reprobate and has
Mhm.
been predestined for hell prior to the creation of the world,
Mhm.
right? This is the double predestination idea, then they're already kind of in league with the devil. There's this sense that they're inherently sinful. The devil's already persuading them. So there's
Mhm.
less belief that possession will be manifested externally. But there are possession
Interesting.
cases. So
Yeah.
there are possession cases. There's a really famous possession case in at the end of 1696 in Renfrewshire, which is in the west of the country, west of Glasgow, when a young girl named Christian Shaw experiences symptoms of bewitchment, very similar to what the young girls in Salem have happened.
Mhm.
She starts, vomiting up coals and hot pins and bodily contortions and all those sorts of typical symptoms.
Mhm.
Um, and she names some witches as those who had bewitched her. Now, that's a little different than like the full on demonic possession that you get in a lot of parts of Europe that like sometimes happens in convents and other
Right.
things. But a lot of the symptoms of this are the same. The scripts are pretty similar. So that was
Yeah.
very scary to people. The question of, I think though that you're partially asking is like what's really going on? Like
Yeah.
like Salem is a classic example of this. Like
Well,
why are the
yeah.
young girls like flailing about, like
Right.
screaming that they saw Goody Proctor with the devil or whatever?
Right.
Um, I think if we're looking at demoniacs as a whole, like people who performed possession, either like possessed by the devil or bewitchment, this idea that the witch might, send demons to torture someone or that the witch's specter might torture you. I think without question, there were some people who really felt that this was happening,
Mhm.
right? That they were experiencing something traumatic. They interpreted something they were going through this lens. And,
Yeah.
that was a sort of sense of a religious expression or a conversion experience gone wrong, or just this extreme anxiety about the devil in the world. I think others probably had more modern medical conditions, were maybe epileptic or their symptoms got, certainly Betty Paris, who's one of the key girls who's at the center of the Salem witch trials. She's one of the afflicted girls, and she clearly had some sort of illness going on.
Yeah.
But I think there are others who were probably were probably performing,
Mhm.
right? We're probably faking it initially and then maybe became convinced of the lie along the way.
Mhm.
Sometimes I tell my students, I taught a class on Salem a couple years ago. We are talking about these afflicted girls. Like, what are they doing? Are they trying to get attention because they're girls who are told to not, be seen and not heard, right? They're very
Mhm.
disempowered. And I do think some of them had trauma from various things, and these were real symptoms. I think others, though, they started out by kind of going along, maybe
Yeah.
faking it, but then maybe started to believe it in the same way that if you're like, this happens to my students all the time, if you fake sick for class
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, I have a cough, I'm sick, whatever, I can't go to class, and you're like kind of fake coughing, whatever. And then you're like, oh my God, I do feel kind of sick, right? There is something kind of psychosomatic about the way that this works, right? If
Yeah.
you convince yourself of something, you can feel that way. Anyway, that's a very long-winded answer to your
No,
question,
no, no.
Megan.
I
But
think it's well, and it's actually a nice segue because originally when I was doing research on like who should I talk to about the Salem witch trials, and then I started thinking about the Puritans and sort of
mhm, mhm.
how what you've talked about in Scotland and then England to an extent, like how did their dealing with witches and demonology and all of that, like how did that transfer from or across the Atlantic to the United States?
Mhm,
Like
mhm.
what was brought and then what was uniquely sort of American?
Yeah, I mean yeah, a great question. Let me just say for the readers, the best book on the Salem witch
Hmm.
trials is Emerson Baker's book, The Storm of Witchcraft.
Mm.
It's so good. It's I teach it in class. I think it's the best one, Emerson Baker's Storm of Witchcraft. So I'm just plugging that if you're really interested in understanding Salem holistically. But to answer that question, the big wave of Puritan migration is in the 1630s, but then others sort of come over time. And there have already been witch trials in England. There have already
Mhm.
been witch trials in all of Europe, right? The witch trials have been going on really since the end of the 15th century. So certainly some of them are coming over having read pamphlets like narrative accounts of what happened.
Mhm.
England produces a lot of witchcraft pamphlets, like stories of bewitched kids or stories of witches who do various and sundry things. So they're bringing those ideas, those pre-established ideas about witchcraft across the Atlantic. And then they're in this literal wilderness,
Yeah.
genuinely. And they are
It's not
sort of,
going well.
yeah, it's
Like
not going well. It's not going well. There are sort of indigenous communities on the periphery, because of course these are settlers too, right?
yeah.
They're
Yeah.
part of a colonial project. So there's tensions with indigenous groups, and they're often interpreting those tensions through this demonological lens. Like maybe those Native Americans
Interesting.
are servants of the devil. There are all these wars that happen in the decades leading up to the Salem witch trials, and a lot of people become basically wartime refugees. Like if other communities up in Maine or elsewhere that have had, again, skirmishes with indigenous folks, some of those refugees have like traumatic things that have happened to them, and I think they see these things as evidence of the devil active in the world. Yeah, it is not going well. Like there's all this like anxiety about the political future of Salem. There's worry that the fervor and zeal of the first generation of Puritans have been lost, and some of the like kids of these Puritans don't want to sort of live the really rigorous lifestyle. So part of it is like that is seen as the devil maybe at work and tempting people. So it is the reason I like Emerson Baker's book is its fundamental idea is like this is a perfect storm of stuff. People are bringing those ideas, but then it's a really intense environment. It's a different environment. It's a literal wilderness, and there's a lot that feels unknowable
Yeah.
and anxious. And then, really, the key ingredient, though, in why the Salem witch trials get so bananas so quickly, you have some untrained judges who are involved who allow like evidence, like spectral evidence. The idea that like a witch can be in her bed, an accused witch can be in her bed, but her specter can torture you. That's kind of a fringe belief by the end of
Mm.
the 17th century, but they allow it. Um, the other factor, really, in Salem is the minister, a guy called Samuel Paris, who a real piece of work. And he was a controversial hire in the town. He really wants to prove himself. And what better way to prove yourself than really go after the forces of evil? So I think he and the first afflicted girls, Betty Paris, that's his daughter, and
Mhm.
Abigail Williams, who may have been a niece. We're not totally sure of that relationship. Like that's in his household. So
Mhm.
the thing about something like the witch trials is you need the belief system, but you also need to have the ingredient of fear, right? You need to have a precipitating event that causes that sort of angst. And this is one of the reasons why, in general, whether I'm looking at the witch trials, whether I'm looking at the ideas about the devil, whether I'm looking at infanticide cases, which is what I'm working on just
Mm.
now, I think it's really important to pay attention to how people in positions of power and authority utilize fear for their own ends, how they try to stoke that in their constituents, their people, because it's that fear and it's that sense that there's this other,
Mhm.
this sort of demonic force that you have to go after that can really lead to tragic consequences. And I think the period that I study is full of those examples.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's funny as you're saying, like, oh, the generation hasn't, the next generation isn't taking on the fervor of the first generation. And
Yeah.
it's like nothing changes. Like, it's just
No,
like,
yeah, no, listen, I remember when I was growing up, like my grandfather would be like, these millennials, because I'm an elder millennial. I'm like a geriatric millennial. I'm at the very tail end of,
yeah,
what counts as a millennial.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that was like like millennials are never getting jobs, they're spending their money on avocado toast or whatever, right? Like
yeah,
that sort of narrative of them losing the work ethic, that has been there. Like you can look at newspaper articles from like virtually any time,
yeah,
ever since newspapers have been around, where there's been like lamentations of what the next generation is doing.
yeah,
So, then there are panics about technology every generation. Like when the
yeah,
printing press was invented, people were like, "This seems bad. Like, people, how do we make sure like misinformation isn't spreading?" And there was freaking out about that,
yeah.
which is
Like,
interesting
just
to think
wait.
about. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know exactly. Like you think a printing press was hard to control. Like
Yeah.
you
Now
don't
we
even
can't
know
give
about
people the
Twitter. You
right.
don't even know
Yeah,
about. Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. So,
Exactly. And how do you think, and you can talk about this in any sort of way, whether it's global or, related to Scotland or in the United States or all the above. Like, how do you feel like that historical context influences how we as a society interact with the supernatural today? Like,
mhm, mhm, mhm.
and I think I just think I have to laugh because I'm like, man, nothing changes. Like when I was a kid, it was like, don't use a Ouija board, and people are still weird about that. And
Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so this is I keep saying this is a good question. These are all
Yeah,
great questions. This is
good.
why you're
I'm
a
glad.
podcaster. This is why you have a podcast. You're going to be doing it.
I'm just nosy. I'm just nosy.
No, I love it. Listen, being a historian is basically like being a journalist for the past. It's because you want to know the tea. You want to read about the drama. Like that's totally it. Like
Let me tell
without
you
a
something.
question.
I have read, and friends who know me personally are gonna laugh at this, but like I grew up in Maryland.
Mhm.
So colonial history was just like around us all the time.
Yeah, yeah,
When
yeah.
I got to read letters between the founding fathers about like their farming practices, they're like,
Yeah.
my corn's not growing. I was like, girl, tell me about it. Like, I
Yeah,
love it.
no,
It's
for
so
sure.
interesting.
It's yeah, it's absolutely like that. There's something about being a historian that can also be a little bit voyeuristic, but it's like acceptable, right?
Yes.
To like be nosy about people's
Yeah.
personal business.
Yeah.
Anyway, but to this question of how did these historical ways of thinking about the supernatural influence like the sort of world today?
Hmm.
I've been thinking about this a lot. So I co-edited a book with two of my colleagues that came out in May called The Rutledge History of the Devil. And it traces the idea of the devil from its scriptural foundations, which are, very unstable, right? There's not the idea of the devil develops from the building blocks of scripture, but there's no coherent narrative of the devil in the Bible. It's very
Hmm.
different and it's messy between the Old Testament and New, yada yada. And it goes all the way to the present. And it looks at how ideas about the devil and ideas about evil have shaped, for example, reactions to 9/11 or
Hmm.
have informed the QAnon sort of conspiracy theory, right? So there really is a through line here. Um, I'm teaching right now my devil seminar, and I bring it up because we spent the first couple of weeks of class talking about the development of the idea of spiritual warfare
Hmm.
and how that really emerges in the context of the first century as authors of the various gospels are trying to grapple with the fact that there's been a war, the temple's been destroyed. Years before that, the person they thought was the Messiah was and still think is the Messiah was killed. How do we explain that? How do we understand what has happened? And it really they really understood this evil in the world through thinking about the fact that there were all of these enemies that they were grappling with, and that um, these were enemies who were in league with the devil, and that the devil was not some external other, but internal enemies, people who crucified Jesus, people who did whatever.
Hmm.
And they developed a language of spiritual warfare. It's embedded in certain texts of the Bible, like put on, Ephesians, put on the armor of God, all of this
Hmm.
stuff. You can read the Gospels really as wartime literature in this way. But this oppositional idea, right, that the world is made up of the godly, those who are sort of early on in the Jesus movement, and then those who become sort of institutional Orthodox Christians, and all those seeking to subvert what we were trying to do.
Hmm.
Um, this begins in Christianity as a way to explain the really, major experience of persecution,
Yeah.
right? Which early Christians experienced. But then as the church gains power and becomes institutionalized by the time we get really to the high Middle Ages, there's still this sense of being under siege from various enemies, because that idea from early Christendom stays really powerful. And so these enemies might be heretics, they might be fears about, Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, they might be, enemies who are witches or magicians or Jews or whatever. All of these groups get sort of understood through this framework of being demonic enemies. And it really does create this us versus them binary mentality, and the sense of being persecuted that stays in sort of the medieval church and persists throughout time. And I think, um, even now, even from like a secular perspective, we will see a lot of people use us versus them language that replicates this idea that one's enemy is not just someone you disagree with, but a moral enemy, a moral evil. It's not enough to say they're the bad guys and we're fighting a war. What Christianity really does historically is to say, these are the bad guys, we're fighting a war. And in fact, we're fighting a cosmic war against them. We're with God, they're with the devil. And I think that is dangerous, because it's the flip side of demonization is dehumanization. Once you decide your enemies are in league with the devil, you can totally dehumanize them. And that certainly happens in various ways during the Inquisition. It happens during the witch trials. It happens in a more secular guise, of course, in the context of the rise of the Third Reich and the events of the Second World War. So, and then it shows up again in McCarthyism to some extent, right? There's a reason Arthur Miller modeled the Crucible on this. It shows up again in satanic panics of the 1980s of people doing, various things in preschools and being the devil worshippers. The devil becomes this like really explanatory frame for evil in the world and a way to categorize one's enemies without actually having to sort of engage with them. And I think that binary thinking is really influential. And it's had a renaissance. And this is, I think, really important. It's had a massive resurgence in the last 9, 10 years. It's never gone away,
Right.
but people are talking about and thinking with the devil and language of spiritual warfare more than ever before. This is one of the animating ideas within Christian nationalism, that part of the project of sort of insisting that America is a Christian nation, even though I think the founders would be like low key appalled by that idea.
Yeah.
But
Some practice witchcraft.
yeah, so like, but I think part of that is saying who in our society is an intimate enemy, who's it, someone who might be in league with the devil that we have to go after. And so we're still thinking with those spiritual warfare frames. And that is really apparent even in language that you use. If you talk about the enemy within, which is something that we've heard a lot recently, man, that is like first and second century language that has persisted and been recycled and remade for different purposes. And I mean, it's remarkable to me as a historian to see these things deployed in such sort of powerful and dangerous ways.
Yeah.
So
And it goes back to the point you made about fear and control earlier.
Sure.
That through line. It's an easy way to control people if you can make them fearful of the other, especially if the other is something that is invisible and that isn't provable, which almost is an
That's how conspiracies
immunization.
work.
Correct.
Yes.
And it's almost like an immunization of like, no, this is for God. This is for is something higher than country, something higher than politics and separation of church and
For
state.
sure. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the right framing. And I think also it's so the way that scholars sometimes talk about this working is like the devil is a really convenient tool of negative self-definition. And by that I mean if you call a bunch of other people, in league with the devil, agents of evil, the enemy, whatever, that's a way of sort of also trying to define yourself as the person who is the bearer of what is good, moral, godly, etc. And it raises the stakes. It really raises the stakes if someone you disagree with is also, in league with the devil, because it also frames things in this, again, kind of cosmic battle. Because one of the things that's really crucial to understand about Christianity from the outside is it begins as an apocalyptic movement, a sense that the end of days is nigh, and everything is sort of oriented towards that. And it does the urgency becomes really acute. Um, yeah, I've just been thinking about this so much, and I've been teaching this class, this class, and it's interesting to teach this class at a moment when, if you're watching for it, if you're paying attention to it, and you read the news, you will see people using the language of the devil all the time. Megan
Mm.
Kelly, just on her show or whatever,
Yeah.
it's a podcast or show, her show, was talking about how, there were sort of witches selling their wares on Etsy that needed to be sort of burned and rid of because they were messing with the forces of evil and demons which have been unleashed in the world. And like, she really believes this. I want to be
Hmm.
clear.
Hmm.
It can be about fear and social control, but these people believe it.
Hmm.
Um, but that's, I think that can be a really dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And it seems really apparent to me now, not to sort of be too political about it, but it's very clear in how immigrants are talked about. It's incredibly clear in how trans folks are
Oh, yeah.
talked about. I mean, it's in fact, there's a law professor who's arguing that the trans panic is the new satanic panic. And I really think
Mm.
the way that some of that language is getting replicated about children, what about the children? Are they being groomed? Or that animates every
Right.
satanic panic in history. People thought witches were hurting children. Blood libel conspiracies are about that. People think heretics are doing it. But you see it. I mean, it's to me as a historian of this stuff. I never thought what I do would be so relevant.
I'm also really fascinated too because the Megan Kelly thing with Etsy, which is like
Yeah.
I'm on some part of TikTok. I feel like there's a million different types of TikTok you can be on, um, and it's the flip side of that where people are like, oh, maybe I should hire an Etsy witch to like get my boyfriend back
Yes.
or do
So
or cut cords or whatever, and like
yes.
it's fascinating now to see almost this mainstreamification, if that's the right
Yeah.
word for it?
Absolutely. So I people have often asked me, like, what's the future of the devil, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if what's the future of this stuff? And on the one hand is the resurgence of belief in this sort of traditional stuff on spiritual warfare on the part of Christian nationalists, on the American right to a large extent. But on the other side, right there, you have the Satanic Temple was set up in 2013, which is based in Salem. But these are Satanists who don't actually believe in Satan.
No.
Usually Satanists don't, but they see him as a symbol of rebellion and etc. In this sort of embrace of an alternative theology. And you do have a ton of people who are, who like who've become invested in Wiccan or paganism or various alternative spiritualities that allow them to feel empowered
Mhm.
in the world outside of what they often see as this very patriarchal traditionalist system. So you really see a bifurcated understanding of a lot of all of this.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and, as we were talking about, sort of seeing this language and I'm thinking about the United States specifically,
Yeah.
um, with the whole thing about, like, the Haitian community and eating the
Hmm.
dogs, and I was thinking
Hmm.
about, this isn't only a racial piece, which is certainly part of our narrative and history in the US, but also, like, that idea of voodoo, and these
Hmm.
are, and in different cultures,
Yeah.
which leads me to this question of pre-colonialism,
Hmm.
do
Hmm.
we see similar things happening in other cultures, like non-Western,
Mm.
non-European cultures? Are we
Mm.
seeing any of that or not really? Like, does the devil exist in pre-colonial South Africa, which wasn't South Africa, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah. So let me say with the caveat that I'm not an expert in any of
yeah.
this stuff because I studied sort of Christian ideas. But what I will say very definitively is that when European Christians, be it Catholic or Protestant, engaged in the colonial project, either through
Mhm.
missionary work or explicit sort of outright colonialism, they often observed indigenous traditions that had lots of different gods and deities that were often ambiguous, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Prior to the development of sort of Judeo-Christianity, it was very common for cultures to have gods that were neither bad nor good, but could serve both
Mhm.
purposes, or could be a trickster, or didn't have to fall in this sort of piebald mentality, this
Yeah.
binary. So you do have these Europeans going over, and when they encounter those ambiguous deities,
Mhm.
they read them through their binary Christian lens. So, for
Yeah.
example, taking an indigenous idea of a sort of trickster god and saying that's a demon. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of evidence of that, or of, being like Thomas Harriot wrote about his time in Virginia, which really he called it Virginia, but it was Roanoke. And, in that area, and encounters with the folks there. And he recorded some shamanistic practices that were local Algonquin traditions as sort of demonic rituals. And he was like, "Don't worry, we're bringing Christianity to them," and so there you see this happen all the time. Certainly it happens in Africa. There's been the rise in recent years of sort of charismatic Christianity in Africa, which in various parts of Africa, like Nigeria, for example, which is a Western importation and often imposition vis-a-vis colonialism, and it's melded with local animistic and African traditions in such a way that has made the world seem very demon populated indeed. And I think there are sort of dangers again
Hmm.
in that, in removing the ambiguity of experience and of belief, and wanting to see it through this sort of black and white frame. So
Yeah.
certainly in the colonial period, it's just chock a block with demonizing indigenous traditions.
Right. Yeah. Now, turning to like something maybe a little bit more fun is in pop culture. All of this has been fun, I think, and a little scary, but
Yes.
in
Welcome to
pop,
my world, Megan. It's
yeah,
Victoria's.
and in some ways, it's comforting to me, honestly. Like to
Yeah,
see
yeah,
history. I don't, that whole thing of like history doesn't repeat; it echoes or rhymes.
yeah, yeah.
And I think there is something comforting about that of like people have gone through this before. We figured out ways to talk to each other and understand each other, and it sort of goes in waves. But
Yeah.
um
Can I just say
yeah,
one thing about
please.
that? And then I want to get into the fun pop
Yeah.
culture stuff. But my favorite quote about history, it's indeed the quote that made me want to be a historian, was from this, medieval sort of philosophy scholar, a guy called Etienne Gilson. I'm saying his name wrong because he's French and I'm rubbish at French pronunciation. But he had the line where he says, "History is the only laboratory we have in which to test the consequences of thought."
Mm,
And that is what animates my work, right? What does belief in evil do? What does belief in hell do? What does belief in sort of a binary world do?
mhm.
That's what's interesting to me. And history allows us to see the rise and the fall and the consequences of those events. But it also really allows us to see that thoughts change, right? Ideas change. I mean, for me, people are really important in history, but ideas are really what drive it, and what people in power do with those ideas. And I think we're in a challenging moment in terms of ideology, but it's not static.
Right.
I always tell my students, like, you don't like it, y'all can change it.
I
Like,
see that all the
this
time.
is,
We're
yeah,
choosing this.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So it's hopeful to know that we're dealing with things that don't have to be static,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
And there's space in those things for the idea of hope,
Yeah.
right? And thinking about justice and empathy, and
Right.
so
Right.
anyway.
Yeah, I love that. And I draw a lot in my life in understanding the world from the arts, like whether it's music
Mm,
or actual
mm,
art or literature, whatever.
mm.
And I often find myself returning back to Greek mythology, which is like
Yeah,
crazy, right? Like the more you get into it, you're
yeah.
like, this is wild. But there is something so comforting about it that it's like, man, we still believe this stuff today. We're still telling the same stories.
No,
Like,
of course. I was just teaching about the development of the idea of hell, and how, it borrows on the idea of Hades and the underworld.
mhm,
The whole Christian idea of the soul. That's not what Jesus believed. Jesus
right.
would have had a Jewish belief, which is the
Yeah.
idea of the sort of what we think of as the soul is really just the breath, the spirit that animates life, not that it has a sort of separate entity. But when most of the converts to Christianity were Greek,
Yeah.
right, were Gentiles, non-Jews, that's when you get the idea of the separation of the soul and the body. But
Yeah.
that, I mean, if you see like all of these belief systems as palimpsests, right, layered on top of one another, you do realize like how strange all of it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think, and may, I think one of the things that's so great about studying Greek mythology, or studying early Christianity or medieval Christianity, or anything,
Mhm.
um, is that it should encourage you to think about how strange we really are too, right?
Yes.
Like our beliefs are friggin' weird as well, right?
Yes.
I think we
Totally.
often have this sort of post enlightenment, like, look how rational we are. But like, yeah, I don't think that, like, can you imagine the historian 100 years from now who has to explain like some very online phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, without doubt. And there's comfort in the consistency of that strangeness, right? To your
Yeah.
point, right? And we'll
Yeah.
find a way to be strange differently.
And sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's
Oh,
fun
it's super
stuff.
fun.
Yeah.
I love reality TV. I'm
Yeah.
like not too embarrassed to say, like, if we want to do a deep dive on Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, I am like very
You're coming back. Can Mom Talk survive this? Like,
Dogs are fine. Who is actually related to Ben Affleck? Is that like I have questions? Questions remain. You think that we'll come back to after the new season drops? We'll circle back. We'll
yes.
talk about all this.
Yes.
But like that reality feels like a really weird phenomenon. Anyway,
Very. Very. So, and actually, that's a nice segue
yes.
into pop culture. And like, do you see, as you're looking at pop culture, and let's just say from like the last 20 to 30 years, are you seeing a rise in certain themes coming back up?
Mm,
I think zombies are
yeah.
interesting as a new concept and how they may have
Mm,
been shaped
mm,
by like older concepts.
yeah.
I was just talking with Dr. Murphy about Shirley Jackson, actually, who's like
Mm.
so
Oh,
creepy. I
great.
love her.
Yes.
And but we were talking about vampires as a sort of as a concept out of
Yeah.
Ireland and a
Yeah. Yeah.
relatively modern concept. And so are you
Out of
seeing
Ireland. That's interesting.
yeah, well, Stoker is
Oh,
what
sure,
sort of
sure.
what she was talking
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
uh, popularizing it. And are you seeing any sort of like themes in pop
Yeah. Mhm.
culture that maybe are relating to certain times that also relate back to
Yes.
prior literature?
Without question.
Yeah.
I think to some degree this predated the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's accelerated since then. So, people have been really interested since we were younger with
Mhm.
like Buffy the Vampire Slayer was like, I loved, I mean, unsurprising, I love
Yeah.
that show, True Blood, right? To talk about
Yeah.
vampires. The show Supernatural, which I've never seen, but all of
Mhm.
my students mention it to me. Lucifer, is a very popular TV series. The new remake of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which I think is really fascinating in what it
Mhm.
does in terms of playing with the idea of witchcraft and the devil. So what I think is interesting and of course, like South Park, if you watch the new season, like Satan is involved.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
like, I was joking with my students. So we've been talking a lot about the idea of the development of the devil as like an intimate enemy, meaning an enemy from within one's community. And one of my students was like, "Well, in South Park, Satan is really an intimate enemy
Yes.
because anyway, that's the way he's portrayed
Well,
that."
and there's
Um,
a guy on TikTok who dresses up in a really funny devil
oh my
suit.
God, is this Joe Hedges?
I think, and
I
he'll be
think
like, "Come
that
on, let's go do Jello shots."
I so
I'm obsessed.
I love him. We messaged after my Wired video came out.
Awesome.
He like messaged me on Instagram.
Awesome.
Anyway, he's hysterical.
Yeah.
So actually, so there is a rise in all of this, and I think the answer is twofold. A, the devil has become really unmoored from theology in terms of the way that most people think about the devil, meaning in the early Christian period and certainly in the medieval period, people really wanted to understand like what does the Bible say about Satan? What does Satan do in the world? Does he have a body? What are the powers? What do demons do? What do they look like? All of those things. People were asking really like genuine questions
Yeah.
because they took very seriously the theology of all of this. But now, and this has been a trend that's been happening for a few centuries, but it's really clear now that because the devil is detached from theology and has become more a figure of pop culture and
Mhm.
more a figure of rhetorical expression or whatever, that there's just so much flexibility in what people can do with the devil. And sometimes the devil can be used by kind of more traditional white right wing groups in ways
Mhm.
that I would argue is actually divorced from the theology, but is a useful cudgel to talk about opponents. And then on the other side, for folks who are secular, you can play with the devil. You can laugh about the devil. You can have the devil be kind of a romantic figure. And this is true about like witches can become figures of female empowerment, sort of reject sort of patriarchal structures and whatever. So I think I think part of it is that unmooring from theology.
Mhm.
And even actually in like I think people are just less fussed about really unpacking the theology than they used to be, whatever spectrum
Mhm.
people are in. And the other trend is since COVID-19 pandemic, because I think people had to think about death and the afterlife and invisible forces more than they ever have before. And I think
Yeah.
that that has showed up in some of our media. I teach a history of ghost seminar,
Ooh.
and I've taught it a bunch of times. And as part of the seminar, I have students poll students on campus about ghost belief, like, do you believe in ghosts? What do you think they look like? Yada, yada. And it is only since the pandemic that a majority of my students say they believe in ghosts.
Interesting.
And this is like, to be clear, this is not like a Pew Center
Yeah,
style
sure, but
survey.
it's interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, it is. If any of my sociologist colleagues listen, they're going to be like, "This is terrible data collection." But I'm going with it. It's like my personal data collection.
Yeah.
Um, and I asked my students, like, "Why do y'all think this is?" And it's because of sort of coming out of a trauma. I think the
Mhm.
supernatural in general is showing up on the right, is showing up in pop culture, is showing up in lots of ways as a response
Mhm.
to the real instability of the financial crisis, the real instability of sort of the rise of populism, right wing populism and authoritarian movements globally as a
Mhm.
response to the pandemic. I mean, it's been, to go back to that idea of Salem, this perfect storm of factors that has given really rise to a satanic renaissance, a supernatural renaissance, however we want to frame that.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really interesting. And I didn't think about COVID-19, but talk about the ultimate invisible force worldwide.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you really had people starting to think about, is this a sign of God's wrath? Like, how do we think about plague? I was talking to my father yesterday, who's a politics junkie. So, like, we talk like 4 times a week on the phone about politics. And we were actually talking about like what it might do to the lived experience of religion or religiosity if we have the resurgence of living in a world where there are actually lots of plagues, lots of pandemics, because that's how the world used to be.
Yeah.
And it was bad. It was super disruptive when you had a wave of the plague, when you didn't have access to medicine, inoculation, all those sorts of things. And it really made the community fearful of outsiders because they might bring in
Of course.
disease, all of these things. And it, made a lot of people want to churn towards the church, A, for answers and for comfort and solutions, but also for, if they're going to die because of the bubonic plague, they want to die a good death and go to heaven, right?
Right.
And I am curious what will happen if we live in a world where people are getting polio and people are getting, you know, who knows, bird flu, who knows what is on the
Right.
horizon, but
Right.
will that shift the way that people think about life versus afterlife? Because we have lived, and this is important for people to understand, we have lived in a period our whole lives of incredible comfort, incredible longevity,
Yes.
incredible health,
Yes.
incredible freedom. And I think when you study history, you realize what it means to make decisions that threaten the comparative privilege of modernity that we have lived in, which is not to say it's perfect. It's certainly not huge
Sure.
income inequality, but like most of us have expected, to live long lives, not to see dead bodies, like those
Right.
sorts of things. And it is interesting to ask the question of what would it mean to put those things in jeopardy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I'm sitting here in Florida. So I'll let you know
Oh,
how it
oh,
goes.
well,
Cause
report back. I'm from
yeah,
Texas, so
yeah,
I,
it's
we'll
wild.
compare notes on our
It
later.
it's interesting.
Yeah.
So I moved to Florida from DC, and my kids were born in DC, and I remember our pediatrician was a lot older, and I actually was looking for an older
Mm,
pediatrician
mm,
because I
mm.
wanted some experience.
Sure.
And he was like, first of all, you had to be vaccinated in order to be a patient there.
Mm,
There
mm,
was no
mm,
question about that.
mm, mm.
Um and he just said, he was like, "People don't know what polio looks like. People don't know what
Yeah,
measles look like." And
exactly.
he
Yeah.
was, and we had, I was like, "Yeah, give them all the vaccines, give them doubles." Like, like I don't want I don't want my kids to get a cold, much less a
Yeah. Yeah.
virus that's going
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
something to them.
Yeah.
But he was just saying that he was like, I have to explain to some parents, like, you don't know what measles looks like and does to you. And we have just lived in an extreme time of health privilege. And it's
Exactly.
fascinating that
Yeah.
we are actively making choices that will hurt us
Yeah.
as a
Oh,
whole.
there's no question there. I mean, there's no question. So, my last book that I just wrote, some of it's about the coming of the plague to this community. So I've thought about this
Hmm.
a lot. And yeah, I mean, I we talk a lot about the economic insecurity that was born of the COVID pandemic, right? It was
Mhm,
a challenging
mhm.
economic time.
Sure.
The US got off a lot easier than a lot of other places. But, it's not as if the increase in diseases only has health consequences,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Economical and other things. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that a lot too.
Yeah.
It's like a
That's
very
so
peaceful
fun.
place in my mind. It's
Yeah. You're like,
just,
what? I'm gonna turn off the news and think about future plagues. That's nice.
right.
Well, and I almost wonder if it's like instead of external forces, unconsciously, if it's like a self-fulfilling process, a
Mhm.
prophecy that now we have to inflict on ourselves. You know what I mean?
Mm,
Instead of like this
mm,
is coming from beyond, it's almost
mm,
like
mm.
unconsciously are we like, well, we know what this is gonna do, and it'll turn people
Yeah.
toward. I don't know. It is odd to me. I don't get it, and I would love to talk to someone who feels that way just to try and understand, like, I just don't get this. Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
I talked to a like a child um sort of rare disease specialist pediatrician who maybe is in Florida,
mm,
might be in Florida, but somewhere in the South. And he was telling me that he's really seen the rise of some of his patients who don't want to seek treatment for their children because they think what their children need is an exorcism. Right,
oof,
that what is
yeah, that's
that what is
tough.
befalling their child and causing really severe autism or whatever it
Right,
might be is not a genetic condition,
right.
or in the cases of other things, a disease or epilepsy that can be easily treated,
Yeah,
but instead is sort of the devil's involvement. And
yeah.
really struggling with like what to tell parents in that way. So I think again, turning to the supernatural as an explanatory mechanism for these things, we may see, I think he said he's already seen a real resurgence in
Interesting.
it.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting. Before I ask if there's anything we haven't talked about that you wanna make sure listeners hear, like, is there anything that you really hope people walk away with or understand about, maybe the history of witches and demons or just like and maybe even just as you go through your day, start looking at these things and just see how,
Mhm,
you know, I was thinking about when you said the ghost thing, right? Like
mhm, mhm,
a lot of times I'll ask friends, I'm like, do you believe in God? Do you believe in heaven?
mhm,
And
mhm,
it's
mhm,
funny because I think we make assumptions, right?
mhm, mhm, mhm.
And I'm curious if there's anything you hope that people walk away from this conversation with or can start seeing how their lives are influenced by something in the 15th century, you know?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. So I would answer in a couple of ways. I think people should be really attentive to and wary of any sort of attempt by a person in a position of power to paint someone that they disagree with or paint a whole group of people even more so as an enemy, to
Mhm.
suggest that they are unnatural or that they are polluting or that they are dangerous, because that is very old language and is often rooted in sort of myth rather than reality. This sort of, for example, this idea that there's this like underground group of XYZ who's trying to invade or overturn or corrupt or groom or whatever. That is a really, it's very powerful to suggest that that is at play because it plays on fears that we all have, genuine fears. But
Yeah.
we should be attentive to how that's being used and how it's mobilized. Is there evidence behind it, right? What's the purpose of doing so? Because I think that that's really, your spidey senses should be up, especially when that language, when people start trotting out the they did this, this is on them.
Yeah.
Who is the they? You should ask that question,
Right.
because I think that that is really important as well. So we avoid sort of essentializing groups or whatever. I also think truly, if there is language that's about harm to children,
Mhm.
um, that is often sort of part of these satanic panics and conspiracy theories, right? The QAnon conspiracy really was rooted in this idea of like children being harmed.
Yeah.
And um, I think if there's no evidence there, no concrete evidence, and it's just like vibes, you should pay attention to that. Now, sometimes there is evidence, like the
Sure.
Epstein files. Like I would
Sure.
actually like us to be concerned about that, right?
Right.
Like the treatment
Right.
of these like
Right.
young girls and things. But
Right. But lizard
so
people sacrificing
exactly.
babies
Exactly.
is
Pay
different.
attention to how
Yeah.
people are using belief as a cudgel and
Yeah.
using fear as a cudgel. So I really think that's worth being attentive to. The other thing I would like listeners to know, which is more related to my like job as a historian, this is a really hard time for people who teach.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes that's not legible to folks. It is a hard time for a lot of people, let me be
Sure,
clear.
sure.
But a lot of people who are teaching in states that have really tried to regulate what can be said in the classroom, it is a brutal time. People go into teaching, be it at the university level, the K through 12 level, never to indoctrinate, but to learn, to explore, to encourage, to empower young people, and to sort of teach them how to be in the world, right? It's more than critical thinking that we're engaging in. We're trying to get our students to embrace critical being, to be
Mhm.
empathetic, to sort of think about the world in which they live. And this has become a time where it's really hard to do it because there's fear of reprisal, of scrutiny, of saying the wrong thing. And that to me it feels like something, like, I think it is great that when a late night show host is, you know, temporarily kicked off air because of a misunderstanding of what he said or because of exercising his free
Mhm.
speech rights. Like, obviously that is tragic, or it's not tragic, but it's awful that someone is not allowed to exercise those First Amendment rights. And we should pay attention to it. And we
Mhm.
should say that that's not the country we want to live in. But I also want people to pay attention to what's happening to people at lower levels, right?
Mhm.
Black journalists who work for the Washington Post, professors in Texas who are trying to teach the truth about sort of gender and
Mhm.
sexuality. Um, I wish there was more of a national outcry about what's happening to ordinary people who are being prevented from doing their jobs honestly and according to their own sort of academic freedom. So
Yeah.
maybe that's more of a soapboxy thing, but I feel like it's going under the radar for a lot of folks. And
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's okay to feel uncomfortable with ideas, and it's okay
yes,
to disagree in
no
the
doubt.
classroom,
Yes.
and I think if I can say anything about this is trust that people can make good decisions. Trust that students are
Absolutely.
engaging in critical thought
Yes.
and can come out with their own, thoughts,
Of
and
c-
that those thoughts are gonna
yes.
change over their lifetime, like,
Yes.
it
Yes. I tell my students this all the time. You may come out of my class feeling really recommitted in what you already believed, and that's great.
yeah,
You may come out of my class thinking, "Oh my god, like, I was totally wrong about what I learned about."
right,
And that's great. You may come out uncertain and being like, "God, this is messy." And that's
yeah.
also great. Like,
You may come
you
out
know
and say, "Great, I got my requirement done." Like,
yes, exactly.
it's
So, and
fine.
I don't know any professor or teacher who doesn't have that exact same attitude.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
and so I think I think it is, I'm glad you said that because I think it's a really difficult time, but I think it's also putting on our students at every age the
Yeah.
idea that they can't think for themselves and
Yeah.
that, there's something scary about them in getting information in and not being able to process that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting, and once again, we've seen this throughout history, so
Yeah.
it's not the first
Yes.
time, it won't be the last, but,
No.
I'm glad you called that out. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you wanna make sure listeners here
Yeah. Can I like
know?
very briefly plug my new book project?
Please do.
Okay. So I'm writing a new book. It won't be out for a while because
Mhm,
I'm still writing it, but I'm writing a book about a woman in Scotland who in 1724 was convicted for the crime of infanticide, that is
mhm,
child murder. She'd almost certainly had a sort of pregnancy loss. She told the courts that her child was stillborn, but she was convicted at a time when there was this very draconian law in the books that treated concealment of pregnancy if you were pregnant outside of wedlock as evidence of intent to murder. So if the baby turned up dead, or if something happened, stillbirth, late term miscarriage, or just something happens during the process of delivery, the mother, if she had concealed that pregnancy from neighbors, from authorities, whatever, she could be charged with child murder. And so this woman that I'm writing a book about was in fact charged with child murder, and she was
mhm,
hanged in Edinburgh in the Grass Market. If you've ever been to the city, it's kind of at the center. It's a big tourist hub. But the reason her case is important is not just that she's this ordinary woman who gets caught up in this moment of real attempts to circumscribe sort of female bodies and sexuality, but she survives her hanging.
mhm,
They cut her down from the noose. They put her body in a coffin and they were taking her out for burial just outside of Edinburgh. And they stopped at a pub to have a pint and to rest. It was an unusually hot day. And there was a knock, knock, knock on the top of the coffin. They opened it. She sat up. And she lived for, because of the law, Scots laws at the time, the sentence had already been carried out. She couldn't be re-executed. So she lived for another 40 years and becomes this celebrity, this spectacle. There's a pub named after her. Her name's called Margaret Dixon. In the Grassmarket of Edinburgh. Sir Walter Scott writes about her.
Wow.
So I am writing a book about her story. I'm writing a book about the ways that that women are made unnatural and called quote unquote unnatural by the laws that sort of policed and circumscribed their behaviors, by the sort of rumor mills that swirl around their sort of bodies and choices, um, and the way that she got sort of depicted as unnatural in the literature that came after that tried to understand why she survived. So I'm writing a book that is her story. It's going to be called Half Hanged Maggie: The Remarkable Lives of Margaret Dixon. Yale University Press is publishing it, but it's with their trade wing. So it will be hopefully in bookstores and things, but it's a really interesting story. It's one that's relevant, but it's also one that tries to recover this woman's voice amid the noise of other people's interpretations of what she did and what happened to her.
Wow. 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 That's interesting. I can't wait to read that.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. And so the three questions that I ask all my guests are, what do you love most about what you do?
Mhm. So, oh God, everything.
Yeah, I can
What,
tell
what
you're
I,
very passionate.
yes. Yeah, I would say actually it's twofold. So, I love teaching. I think if you feel hopeless about the world, and I think it's easy to feel hopeless about the world in this moment, spending time with students of all stripes and political persuasions can be really a reminder of the hope and the energy and the promise of the future. Because I mean, just from my vantage point, students are asking good questions. They are thinking, critically about the world. They are trying to sort of practice empathy and gain it. So,
Mhm.
I mean, teaching is great. And also like it is very fun to come into class and say, let's talk about this really weird thing, right? To try to get back behind the leaves. So, like for me to describe to my students or have them read about a witch's Sabbath, which is like talking about all of these witches fornicating with the devil and like all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And then say, what is this thing that we've just read? How do we get back behind this? How do we
Yeah.
understand the assumptions and the norms and the context and the power structures that made this text and this, witch trial a thing? So I love that.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I love about my job, I love research and writing. Increasingly I'm interested in the stories and the lives of ordinary people who would be otherwise forgotten to us and to history, because these were real people who lived and breathed and loved and hoped just as we do. And to connect with them across sort of the
Mhm.
strangeness of the gulf between the past and the present is, I think, a real gift, um, and something that I think is a really powerful and fulfilling experience. So I love research and writing as well.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And what advice would you give to your younger self?
I would probably tell my younger self to make different dating choices, but um, I think I would encourage my younger self to take more risks. And I have had a very a very goal focused life. I finished
Mhm.
college a year early, undergrad a year early. I went straight to graduate school to get my PhD, went straight to teaching.
Mhm.
I was like, I've got to be a full professor by the time I'm 40. I've got to have
Mhm.
my second book I like had these goals. And I was a bit regimented and blinkered in pursuit of those, which I wish that actually I had just let myself be drawn to, to letting life sort of take me where it wants. I've been unbelievably lucky in my
Mhm.
academic career, like unbelievable luck and privilege without a question. But I think it's also important for people to rest, I think it's important for people to be comfortable with failure. I think it's also like I think I believed a lot of things about what was acceptable for women to put up with when I was
Mhm.
in my 20s,
Mhm.
that I would never put up with now.
Yeah.
And I think I wish also that I could be a little bit more thoughtful about, hey, actually, like that's not okay. That's not cool. So so yeah, put up with less shit from men and
Yeah.
take risks.
Yes.
That's right. Advice to my younger
Yeah.
self.
Well, I'm going to add fornicating witch orgies with the devil as part of my advice
Well,
for my younger
I'm
self.
yeah, absolutely. Dude, get into some witchy stuff for
Yeah,
sure.
totally.
Yeah, hey.
That's so
Um
funny. And how can people find you?
I'm on Blue Sky. I think it's at Mikki Brock, Mikki Brock.
Mhm.
I'm also on Instagram at History Mickey, but that is a private account, so you have to
Sure.
request to follow
Yeah.
me. Mostly that, I have a
Yeah.
website, but it's a terrible website. I really got to redo it. So I don't know if I'd recommend it to folks. But I'm also, on if people listening to this have questions and want to
Mhm.
follow up or want book recs for any of the topics I've talked about, they
Yeah.
genuinely are welcome to just look me up at my Washington and Lee webpage and email me if they have
Yeah.
questions. So
Awesome. Awesome. Well, this was such a fun
great.
conversation. I appreciate all your expertise and time. And um, yeah, this was really fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Wait, What Do You Do Again? For more information about today's guest, or if you'd like to be on the show, please visit megdeford.com. See you next time.